Hello, everybody. I do want to be respectful of your time, so please, let's get started right away. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Media 2070's fourth press briefing. This is a pretty complex topic, so I just want to start with something easy, allow us to check in with each other, and really just drive conversation so you all feel more comfortable engaging with us over the next hour. Okay, Josie, you've already beat me there. I was just going to ask everyone if you can just tell us where you're tuning in from. Um, I would love to just see where everyone is located and just kind of shout these out. Um, Definitely just one of my favorite parts. So I saw Josie commented. We have some folks from Albany, DC, New York City. Um, Please just go ahead. Oh, Newark, New Jersey, Albany. Todd, I love your comment. Yes, Joe is here today. He's going to talk to us a little bit about policies and some of the bigger kind of things that go into what we're seeing in newsrooms. So thank you for joining us, Todd. Um, ooh, Manchester. I love that. New Hampshire. And I know we also have some folks coming in from Kansas and San Diego. So whether you're tuning in live or you're watching this later, thank you for joining us. It is just so inspiring to see how many people believe in media reparations with us. So let's get into it. My name is Tiana Magnon, and I am the owner of Magnon Media. We are working with Media 2070 to raise awareness about media reparations. And it's been really exciting because already we've been able to use these briefings to set up meetings with editors around the nation. Um, we've talked about how to reform newsrooms, and we've just had some incredible publishing opportunities. Diamond, who you'll hear from in a little bit, she just wrote this beautiful op ed for the Buffalo News, and it was placed right on the opinions front page. So just a quick shout out before we get going too far to everyone who has been in this work with us, Black Wall Street Times, the Only One Mic podcast, I see you, The Emancipator, ESPN, Mother Jones. We're just fortunate to really be building a village with us. So today, this press briefing is just really an update on a year of incredible work. Media 2070 has traveled to Harlem to reimagine the future of news, universities across the country to educate student journalists. So I am going to toss it to Vanikia first to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Vanikia Williams, and I'm the campaign manager for Media 2070. So glad that you all are here and taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us. So I'm sure you're already somewhat familiar with Media 2070, but to give you a little bit more context, in October 2020, which feels like a lifetime, and just yesterday ago, Media 2070 was launched and came about into the world with an essay, a 100-page essay that chronicles media harms from the inception of this nation, with the first newspaper selling and acting as brokers for enslaved Africans, up until modern day, where we talk about Sophia Noble's work around algorithms of oppression and things of that sort, the lesser known things around media harm. And we really believe that our work is visibilizing the things that are often left invisible about what this nation does or doesn't do, and the narratives that are told about Black people in particular, the myth of Black inferiority. So our work is to undo that myth, turn it upside down on its head, and also to make sure that we create a news story, that we really do the work of making sure that our imaginations are really brought forward and tell the work of a new world coming to bear. So Media 2070, we're in our third year, and there's so much exciting work that's happening, some of which you'll hear about a little bit later today, some of which Tiana mentioned. We've taught college courses, we've done a film, Black in the Newsroom, we've done Black Future Newsstand, which has traveled from Harlem to Austin and hopefully some other cool places. We have policy work coming forward with the FCC, which you'll hear about. We have different cultural and infrastructural innovations that are coming about that we truly can't do without people like you. So thank you for your partnership. Thank you for believing in us and believing in media reparations. And with that said, I'd pass it back to Tiana. I believe you'll be hearing a little bit more about Media 2070 and what we've done.
Yes, thank you, Benicia. 3 years is such a short time for so much incredible work. So I don't mean to speak for everyone, but it is so inspiring just to see the drive that you all have. And I think Diamond, who I would love to bring on stage, Diamond Hardiman, has done such incredible work working right with editors and newsrooms. And she's actually going to tell us about a series of videos that she's been working on, specifically the reparative journalism video and just more of this work. So, Diamond, can you tell us a little bit more and maybe we can watch this video with everyone?
Yes, thank you, Tiana. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all today in the beginning of the new year. So grateful for everybody that's joining us. My name is Diamond Hardiman. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the reparative journalism manager here at Free Press. And so I work with the Media 2070 and News Voices team, continuing in the lineage of Media 2070's call for reparations, media reparations. And so what I'll be doing today is talking a little bit about my work and explaining how this initiative is working to build systems that repair harm. So how are we responsive to the harm that Media 2070 talks about in their essay, where we talk about the history of anti-Blackness in the media and in news. And so, like I said, reparative journalism is just a continuation of that lineage, where we're focusing on the call for media reparations, specifically within journalism institutions and with its stakeholders. So that looks like newsrooms, that looks like college campuses, it looks like journalists and media makers, and it also looks like community members. And really the ultimate goal of this work is to initiate repair processes and initiate healing within communities. And so with that, that's kind of an intro to it. I'm going to pause here and let us talk about some of the ways that this work is wrapped into the rest of Media 2070's visioning and media reparations work. And we can go ahead and play Media 2070's 3-year anniversary video. And so let's give a little pause as we try to get that one up onto the screen. And after that, I'll come back and share a little bit more examples of how this work is filling out Media 2070's mission and our visions for a new world by 2070. Thank you. I really love that video. So I was so in tune and so leaning in, but I think it's really important to talk about the whole context of how this work fits together. And we'll hear a little bit more about that today when we talk with Joe, but how journalism interacts with culture, interacts with policy, interacts with community members. So really happy to be part of the ecosystem that's working on these different things. But back to reparative journalism. Like I said, it's just a continuation in the lineage of the call for media reparations with a specific focus on journalism. And so what we look to do is build repair models and processes for those stakeholders and communities to begin initiating repair and prioritizing healing on the road towards media reparations. And for us, media reparations is a world where Black people are able to own and control their stories from ideation through distribution. So we're really thinking about how do we sow the seeds? How do we start blooming flowers of repair so that we can engage in these repair processes and get to the other side of reparations? So a little bit about how this project started. Of course, the foundational text is the Media 2070 essay, but I also did a lot of research with working Black journalists and media makers. I went to a lot of community events, and I also did research on societal level repair processes in the aftermath of large-scale harms. So things like the Truth Commissions in South Africa, things like Land Back, and of course reparations here, but it's also a global movement. And just really learning what kind of things are present, what kind of things are possible when we prioritize and center repair. And so some of the learnings that I had from that were these 5 or 6 phrases that kept coming up with people about what needs to be present or what is present when we prioritize healing and repair, specifically in journalism. And I'll point out a few, but one of my favorite ones is joy. I had a lot of conversations about how joy and beauty and art is present when we're talking about these very heavy things and the weight of anti-Black harm and how it impacts communities. Another one, I couldn't have a conversation without talking about accountability. So how are we looking at accountability for institutions, for newsrooms, for leaders that have kind of helped undergird this system where we're extracting from Black folks and where news and sales come at the expense of Black communities and their personhood and their narratives. Care is something that Media 2070 talks about a lot as the antidote to harm. So when harm has occurred, how do we begin to care for each other more as a response and as a way to build new worlds? And then also talking about alternative economic models. So what are ways that we can resource and provide people with the things that they need so they can tell stories about healing and so that they can tell stories about repair? And so when we talk about reparative journalism, this is really what we mean. Stories that center these things specifically in response to anti-Black harms, relationships within newsrooms and among newsrooms and the communities that center and prioritize these things. It can also look like creating space for community members to grieve and talk about the journalistic harms that they've experienced. It looks like challenging the journalistic norms about who is a part of the journalistic process. And it's also about engaging the future of journalism to build more reciprocal, more caring, and more practices that focus on solidarity. And then we've got a few examples that we'll also get into later that you see across your screen, but these are newsrooms and these are some of our allies and partners that are doing this work. Sometimes it also looks like investigating and creating content that highlights the ways anti-Blackness has negatively impacted community and prioritizing telling holistic, human, reciprocal stories about Black folks in their communities. And so that's kind of the story of reparative journalism, where it came from and what it can look like in practice. And so we took all that research that I just explained and we made it into a video series that will be premiering today, video 1 of a 4-part series. And so what we also found when we're talking about what's present when repair and healing are prioritized is also space to talk about the truth of the harm that has occurred. And so a lot of times we always like to start with acknowledging the harm. And so our first video in the series will be about that. It'll be talking about the ways that journalism throughout the centuries has impacted different communities, and particularly focusing on the thesis of Media 2070 about how anti-Blackness is really central to that marginalization and how we can kind of see it spread to different places. So we're going to go ahead and queue up that video. And this is the first of a few. And in the follow-up email, we'll make sure to get in contact with folks as the next few videos come out, where we'll be defining more about what do we mean by repair, what have we learned from these global processes, and then talking to people that are practicing it and doing that work. So I'll go ahead and pause there, and then I'll be back after the video. In the United States, the journalism industry has a legacy of harming Black communities and other communities of color. Not all of us have learned this history. Even those of us who practice as journalists know only portions of this story. Let's take a look back at 3 historic examples of media harm. First, the Boston Newsletter. The Boston Newsletter, our nation's first continuously published newspaper, ran its first slave ad less than a month after its founding in 1704. The paper's publisher served as a broker with enslavers, publishing at least 66 slave ads with inquiry of the printer in the notice. These ads resulted in the sale and trafficking of as many as 100 enslaved African and indigenous people. Second, the Rocky Mountain News. In 1864, U.S. cavalry troops slaughtered nearly 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho people in what became known as the Sand Creek Massacre. The Rocky Mountain News framed the massacre as a military victory and applauded soldiers for defeating what the newspaper had portrayed as a dangerous indigenous community. Only later did the truth surface. This was a mass murder of mostly women and children. Third, the Hearst and McClatchy newspaper empires and other West Coast papers. Newspapermen William Randolph Hearst and V.S. McClatchy fueled anti-Japanese sentiment in the early 1900s. Their papers created and amplified vicious stereotypes that over time cultivated acceptance of Japanese American incarceration during World War II. These are only 3 of the countless examples of journalism's history of harm. It's taken the work of many scholars and journalists of color to piece together the industry's roots in oppression and anti-Black racism.
As someone who's been studying history and working on a media history and working on the Media 2070 project, we have seen the long history of anti-Black racism in the media system, how the media system itself is a part, like any other system that was created in our country, was created to uphold a white racial hierarchy. I was fortunate enough working on a book several years ago, Juan Gonzalez now, that we talked a little bit about the history of anti-Asian, anti-Chinese, anti-Japanese racism in the media system, and the same is this, like the same kind of harms, violence perpetrated against the community. It was done just like it has in the indigenous community and the Latinx community and so forth, so on. So this is history of white supremacy in the media system and the function it plays.
It's important for us to recognize that anti-Blackness is the fulcrum of white supremacy, and our failure to address our media's anti-Blackness impacts all communities of color. And research shows that media harm continues today, with detrimental impacts on Black communities and other communities of color. News outlets still act as stenographers for the police, failing to question law enforcement's talking points and repeating outright lies. Newsrooms still amplify racist and xenophobic narratives that result in harmful policies, and they still profit from perpetuating oppression. We can't change journalism's past, but we can be part of writing its future. A growing number of journalists, media outlets, and constituents are joining a long-standing movement working to transform journalism. The directive is to push the industry to live up to its highest ideals of being the first draft of history, a service that provides care and information to community in a field willing to hold power accountable. To bridge our past to our future, we need to embrace reparative actions in journalism to get to a liberated tomorrow. In our next video, we'll share what the media can learn from global repair movements and embark on a journey toward reparative journalism. Hey y'all, I hope you like the video. I always get caught lacking, just enjoying the video. But I really want to give a shout out to my News Voices team that helped produce that video, and particularly Alicia. She helped with the editorial work on that video and the production. And so just really grateful to be able to share that story in some of the ways that people are asking for information to be able to be shared and told with them. Um, and so I just wanted to take a moment here because at Media 2070, we really talk about ourselves as a place where we talk about the harm that impacts communities and the way that the anti-Blackness in media impacts communities. But we also understand that Black journalists are also part of communities, and that all journalists belong to communities. And so we understand the double jeopardy that they face a lot of times, where there is harm going on within the institution, but then there is also the harm that they're experienced by the mischaracterization and the violence that can sometimes come from news reportings about their communities. So we just wanted to pause for a moment and give the audience time to reflect. And if you have any questions, you can drop those in the chat, but to really think about, as a journalist who experiences that, what would be possible for you if repair was prioritized. We really like to think of ourselves as dreamers and visionaries here too. So how do we hold this harm while also imagining what we want for the future? So what would be possible if your newsroom or your field was able to prioritize repair and healing in your work? And even if not that, what are some things that you notice that need some prioritization of repair and healing? And so while folks are marinating on that, I'm going to go ahead and kick it to Tiana, and she's going to go ahead and introduce the next portion of this press briefing.
Yes. Wow. Thank you, Diamond. I'm just like you, where I just sit there and watch the video and soak it all in again and again and again. Um, it's really tough to be in this work where, so much of it can be demoralizing. But I want to, before we kick it to Joe, just kind of bring up what Diamond said, where we're dreaming as big as possible. If we're going to do the work of reimagining complete systems, this is not the time to half step. And so, as you're kind of just musing on some of these questions, what you want to see in your newsroom or in news in general, I really encourage everyone to just think as big as possible. This is not something where we're going to say, hey, that's not possible. Our understanding is that 2070 is quite a ways from now. And with the right work, with the right village, it's more than possible. So, for the second half of this press briefing, we're going to shift a little bit into a Q&A. We are going to bring Joe on stage. He is our policy wonk. He is a great history buff as well. And so while we do have some questions already planned for our guests, I really do encourage you to take a second, ask us questions, and I will be moderating the comments as we go. So please, just as soon as you have a thought, a question, or anything, kick it over to us. And as soon as we have a break in the conversation, we'll ask Joe and Diamond your questions. So, um, Joe, I'm going to bring you on. Can you give us a quick introduction? Tell the room about yourself.
Well, I'm Joseph Torres. I've been working at, I'm one of the co-founders of the Media 2070 project. I've been, Media 2070 is a project of Free Press, which is a media and tech advocacy organization. Been around for 20 years, and I've been part of here, Free Press, for 16. But I was a journalist for several years early on, and worked for the National Association of Hispanic Journalists for a lot of years, and co-wrote the book, as you showed, Diamond showed in her video, with Juan Gonzalez, News for All the People. But for me, I just believe it's hard for us to achieve any kind of racial justice in our society. It's hard to achieve that without changing the narrative, right? The narrative, the narrative is a political weapon, right? And it's wielded by those in our media industry, in the media companies, who are part of trying to use their institutions to uphold white racial hierarchies. And so for me, understanding the history, we continue to learn more about things we should know about, and we just do not know. to actually have a diagnosis of what is the problem we're trying to solve. Because lots of times what we're trying to do is to change these institutions, and the question we have to ask ourselves, are these institutions, can they actually change? They're political. They have a political purpose. They have they exist for a political reason, right? And again, when it comes to race, it's upholding racial hierarchy. So what is it that we need to, what kind of system do we need to build? What needs to change in order for us to have a reparative future, as Diamond is talking about? And so that's my curiosity. My curiosity is like diagnosing the past to understand the present, but what do we do about the future, right? And we have to spend time thinking about what is the world we want to create, as Diamond is talking about. And for me, I'm thinking about the structural part. I'm thinking about like the federal government has played a long role in helping to create every industry that comes about, including the media industry, and its rules and regulations have helped to determine who has the power to control and disseminate information to the masses, and it's a policy of exclusion. And who are those who, like so many of our community publications, who are struggling to tell a story? So right now, I just say like there's an effort right currently, for example, right now. Going on within journalism there's this whole conversation happening across the country about saving journalism, because we have to they say we have to save journalism in order to save democracy, and there's states getting involved in considering funding local journalism. Foundations, there's a coalition called Press Forward of 22 foundations, led by MacArthur and Knight Foundation, that's going to invest $500 million to $1 billion in local journalism over the next 5 years, is a way to, they believe, is to fight against misinformation, disinformation, but also to save democracy, they say. But as we say in 2070, when hasn't journalism been in crisis for Black folks, and when hasn't democracy been in crisis for Black folks and other folks of color as well? It's always been, and then journalism has always been in crisis for us, for our communities. And so if we're going to achieve some so-called multiracial future, it's so-called multiracial democracy, we have to be able to have greater control over the creation and distribution of own narratives. There should be a robust BIPOC media ecosystem, in my opinion, that is not based on maximizing profits, right? And so what can we create? And I'll stop here. And thinking about the future, is there a world, can we envision a world where anti-Black narratives have been deconstructed? Anti-Black narratives were constructed for a political purpose. Can they be deconstructed? And we believe there's a world where you can deconstruct these narratives. And as my colleague Alicia Bell, who's one of the founders, said, once you go through a reparative process, when harm happens, you're in a better position to address it quickly than we are now, than we're positioned now. So, so structure is just, I'll stop here. Structure is about how do we own and control and have the financial resources, because there's a lot of folks making money off of the financial resource of the public good, over the control of the airways and digging up the streets, that the government's helping to subsidize the profit of these companies by allowing them to use the public good in order to control the creation and distribution of narratives and the stories they tell. And we know that racism sells, racism, especially in local news, racism is profitable. So I'll stop there, and I'll take any questions, but I don't go too long, so I'll stop there.
No, that was perfect. And I'm actually happy you brought that up, because Todd brings up News for the People, which is, if you haven't already, please check it out. It is such an incredible read. And I think one of the first to really dig into what needs to happen, but also how we got here. Joe, you brought up money and profit, and we've been talking about the need to kind of change the narrative, own our own structures. I want to have a very frank conversation. Can reparative journalism, can we build these new systems while the focus is still so much on profit? What does this actually look like?
It's a tough, it's a tough thing because the non-commercial media system that we tend to think about in this country is also a commercial non-commercial media system, right? It's brought to you by the biggest corporation in the world, the underwriting. And so, we have to think about, in my opinion, how to claim back some of the profits being made from these companies and from the use of public good in order to provide funding for local communities across the country, and robust funding, because folks are using our airways as a free license to broadcast. Folks are digging up our streets and to lay down cable so they can provide us with not just broadband, but also cable access. And what are we getting in return, right? What are we getting in return? And so there's a lot of money being made off the public good, right? And so to me, that's the places we have to start looking at and thinking about, like, how do we claim back some of that money in order to fund our institutions? And in a non-commercial way, where there's in a way in which the pressures for profit, maximizing profit it's the goal of maximizing profit it can take away the pressure of that being the case, right? Of how do we maximize profit? Because maximizing profit and doing what's right for the community, it's a contradiction. It's often a contradiction, right? You can't do one. Thinking about maximizing profit and then serving the community, it's a contradiction. I think in the news industries, it shouldn't be about maximizing profit, right? It should be about have the resources to serve the community in a way in which that you need to, and not worrying about whether there's any resources where you're going to run out of resources. There should be resources there for to continue to support these institutions. And what is the new economic structures, as Diamond was mentioning in a video, that needs to be created to ensure that?
No, yeah, I think we should keep going right there. I see the conversation bubbling up where it's not just kind of talking about our narratives, but also how we disseminate this news. And Joe, you are one of the best folks to kind of talk about funding and all of these different, the policy that has kind of created these large funding gaps between smaller newsrooms and mainstream news. Can you talk a little bit about you got into radio licensing. Can you talk a little bit about what would need to happen as we think about the structures for dissemination as well?
Well, I think one of the things that I mentioned already is with the foundations is that's a leverage point that exists currently. That's real money going out to real people, and we know the history of foundation and the lack of underinvestment, the lack of investment in BIPOC media. It's a long history of it, right? And so there is, groups like Borealis Philanthropy has been working to organize the BIPOC ecosystem to have their voices heard and tell these funders that to fund our community. So this is something you can do in the media. I think the steps to repair the future is going to take, like you said, over 70 years, a lot of things that have to happen in order to achieve this reparative future that we're talking. We're trying to create a future that really hasn't existed, right? And so this is a leverage point in the immediate. How do we change the funding structures and the funding priorities of foundations to fund our institutions, right? And so, are these foundations going to give money to institutions that have been harming us, right? So, we've seen all these newspapers apologize in recent years. These newspapers have these newspapers and these institutions have a long history of harm. We need to fund a different structure. But two, it's like, I still think there's a need to be, like, the reason why we focus on history is that there needs to be an acknowledgement, right, of harm, right? So right now, as you mentioned before, we're also working on, when it comes to the FCC, working on the FCC, calling on them to examine its history of racism, because it knowingly gave broadcast licenses to white segregationists in the creation of the FCC. For instance, in creation of the FCC, the first chairman of the FCC was the former Chief Justice of the Mississippi Supreme Court. our communities were not going to get broadcast licenses, and so we have to reconcile with the foundation and how it's built, and to start addressing what are the different interventions government can make to actually addressing, and that's a long-term project, right, into addressing its role in creating these systems that uphold white racial hierarchy. We have a paper that's going to be coming out soon that addresses this topic of the creation of the FCC and in the in the racist histories of those who created it, because the folks who created were eugenicists and Herbert Hoover, for example, was one of the presidents, and he was key in the creation of the modern commercial radio industry, and he was one of the chief architects of racial housing covenants. And so we weren't going to get licenses. Our community weren't going to get licenses with this ideology. This it was 50 years after Reconstruction, and these folks who were creating the FCC and stuff like that were living through the era of Reconstruction, and this was a backlash to Reconstruction as well. And so, very much like right now is a backlash to what happened 50 years ago to the present day. Same thing was happening then as well, right? And so, these are the kind of things that we're going to be talking about and trying to understand of how do we get here, because it's hard. We have to have a diagnosis and understand how we got here in order to be able to understand what needs to change to go forward, so we don't replicate into the same harm and continue to try to integrate these institutions that continue to harm us.
Yes. And the same thing with the paper on the FCC. Diamond mentioned when the videos come out, we'll email them to everyone. Same with this. Joe, I also want to bring Diamond back on stage because we have an excellent question from the Kansas City Defender, where we're looking at how can smaller newsrooms increase their editorial capacity, that output to compete with harmful narratives. I'm thinking about how in a lot of cities, the police will put out breaking news reports at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. on a Friday. So how do you make sure you're competing with all of this stuff without reinforcing that capitalist expectations on your newsroom and your staff?
That is such a great question. Happy to have the Kansas City Defender in the chat. Big fans of that org. And I think that it's a really complicated question, but I think that there's layers to it in terms of how are we shifting the culture of what news production and news dissemination looks like. Like you said, sometimes the police offer press releases, they offer sound bites, but how are we reshaping what we understand to be the information that our communities need to be safe, to see themselves. And I think that one of the things that I think about most is how we can tap into the different ways that we are storytellers and the different ways that our communities tell stories and share information. And so thinking about how newsrooms can partner with librarians. And this one's a little controversial, but even how folks can partner with people that work in organizations that serve community. Those are information sharers. How are we working with content creators and storytellers within our communities that can help build up in the places that we don't have the necessary resources that we should have, and that, like Joe said, that we are working on changing the structure so that we do have access to more resources. But how are we creatively using the ways that we tell stories and we share information so that we can collaborate with people and kind of share some of that burden so that we can move at a pace that feels better and tell stories that we want to tell that feel good for our communities.
It's funny that you say that. It reminds me of one of the folks we work with all the time, Temple University, and Andrea over there and Tahi. They're doing such cool work to try and see if residents can tell stories. What do we need to do to just get normal, everyday people to practice journalism? And it's such an interesting way to kind of erode that barrier between the newsroom and the city. I also want to kind of piggyback on that because I saw Josie's question. When it comes to Black publishers, journalists, whether they're in a mainstream outlet or it's their own outlet, what strategies can we think about for those who actually have a decision-making role? What should they be thinking about?
Yes, I think we're pulling up the question. So how can we design strategies for folks to be at the table, especially when we're talking about funding and when we're talking about these bigger decisions that are going on in policy. And I'm going to be a broken record on this, but I really think information is power in that sense. And so how are we looking to our friends that are publishers, our other newsrooms, not just in our own locality, but across the country, to think about how can we be sharing information with each other about policy, about funding, and how that can build solidarity and power for us to have unified strategies on what kind of positions we want to take, on what kind of requests and calls we have for people in those positions. And so I really think information sharing is definitely one of the biggest strategies. And as Media 2070 is moving forward, and as the reparative journalism work is moving forward, a lot of my focus is on what's going on in California that can help New York, that can help Texas, that can help Kansas. And so I think that just sharing with folks that are doing the same work as you, so that we don't have to keep recreating the wheel, is going to be really important.
And I also want to kick it back to some of the university work that y'all have been doing, just kind of bring that in, because I see in the comments folks are talking about just the history of journalism. And I want to expand that a little bit. And I just think so few Americans even know American history, let alone when it comes to journalism specifically. And I was a former journalist before switching into PR. And I remember, so many of our courses dealing with how to write or how to interview. And so I love the perspective that Vanessa and Todd and everyone are bringing in about how rarely we get the opportunity to learn about how the FCC was formed and how all of these different policies and systems were created around us. Um, can you just talk a little bit, you and Joe, about some of the university work and just the work you've been doing to educate the next generation of journalists?
Yes, I can go ahead and start, and then I can pass it to you, Joe. But we have done a lot of work with colleges to build curriculum around reparative journalism and media reparations as a whole, because what folks are saying in the comments is very true about how the history of the field kind of just gets skipped over in J school. And then journalists are entering a field without the full context and understanding of how it impacts community and what the real relationship to communities are. So it's really important for folks to have access to that history, if nothing else, just so that journalists have more autonomy and power in understanding what role that they're playing in society and in community. But we do have a lot of courses where we're teaching that history, but we're also doing the arc of, this is the history, this is how we got to where we are, and we also want us to put our hands in the sand and into the dirt, into building and shaping the ground for what we want next. And so we do a lot of courses that include art making and visioning. Vanikia and I have taught, Vanikia teaches a whole course at Colorado College, and I just come in sometimes and do art with students, where we ask them, what are headlines from the future? What are stories that would be written from the future if we were in a world where care was abundant, where reciprocity was abundant? What would be possible? And so we really are just talking to folks that haven't necessarily entered the field yet and igniting the imagination and the possibility so that we can plan the steps for tomorrow. And yeah, I'll go ahead and pass it to Joe. But for us, it really is just giving people the space to even have the opportunity to have a say and power in how the field is moving.
Yeah, I want to say like that this year's we're only 3 years old. We just turned 3, and it's been like an amazing 3 years. And one of the areas in which it's been really just pleasantly affirming, let's say, is the feedback we're getting from colleges. The folks who are using our essay in their classes, and we hear about it, and we get invited to speak to different classes, and just the number of folks that we've heard from who use our essay or want us to speak to their classes, it's been like, it wasn't something that we anticipated that, and when we began, and so it speaks to something. It speaks to an area of potential of one of the things that, we're a 3-year-old project, and we've grown in the past 3 years a lot in our learning. And, and this year we're really working hard to really understand our strategy for like how continue to hone down on our strategy to like, are we doing the things that we need to do in order to set up to take the steps now to continue to set up the future, so we can have not just continued success, but also see like material change. But one of the areas is it's the students. It's the idea of like there is something there. There's something that's being embraced with a lot of different students and a lot of professors who are bringing this into their classroom. And so so there's something there. There's something there that we have been investing in and continue to ask, and very excited about working in the space and being called into the space. We've been called into it. And we it's like, can we continue to build? One of the jobs I think of folks in leadership and leaders is to create more leaders. And so like the idea, like I know like any of us who are on this call, we probably can trace our evolution as human beings and in our own personal professional life of who was that person that inspired you to take the course that you did. And from one of my inspirations, or at least was a professor in college, where I didn't know what I was undecided, and I took a media criticism class as part of an elective, and she would speak to me after class, and about like because I was really the first class I really got interested in, and she nurtured me wanting to learn more. And so being in schools and all that is like it's exciting, because it has the potential for us to think about how that folks are coming out of there with, I'm seeing in the chat, I finally was able to see some of the chat with like was with a skill set, a critical, not just like the skill set how to technically write anything, but like the critical skill set to be able to analyze like what is the function of these news organizations, and what are they perpetuating, and what needs to be different. We hopefully can continue to build with folks like this, maybe in 2030, 2040, 2050, they're leading this effort to get us to 2070. So I'll just stop there.
I do want to quickly shout out Josie's comment about breaking class structure. Yes. I brought up a quick example about Philly, Chicago training community residents. It is something that's happening in different places, but specifically, not all journalists have been to J School. We train community reporters from the community. We write news grounded in liberation. 500%. I love that. I just wanted to shout that out. There's no question. But I do want to ask quickly if we can kick it over to Diamond. Obviously, a lot of your work is a little bit more intimate with these newsrooms, but would you be able to maybe provide like an anonymous example, maybe a newsroom that you've worked with where you've seen change and how, you all went about it?
Yeah, there's a lot that I could think of. I do a lot of my work in Colorado, so definitely want to shout out some of the organizations here and the ways that you've seen leadership change, even editors change and content change, and be really responsive, especially in a place where people wouldn't assume that there is a large population of people of color. A small group of people in Colorado have been able to see multiple radio stations and newspapers create coverage that's in response to their calls, in terms of more stories about housing, more stories about education. We have a newsroom that has done a whole series on the inequities in the education system and in housing. They've created whole beats around things like that. There's one newspaper that I will shout them out, the Golden Transcript, in response to some of the work that we've done in Colorado. They actually did an investigation into their paper's history of anti-Blackness, and they specifically focused on how they covered the Black Panther Party when they were coming up. And that was, I thought, like a really interesting angle, because when we talk about solidarity and how institutions can create or widen differences, that was really interesting. So that's one that I could shout out. They talked about how their paper covered the Black Panther Party. But one that I also wanted to talk about, and Joe kind of touched on it a little bit, is there's a lot of newspapers nationally and internationally that are apologizing for the different things that their coverage has done. And so when we talk about coverage, we are talking about narrative of how communities are perceived, but we're also talking about like real instances of violence. We're talking about headlines that have incited riots. We're talking about the way that narratives have built the war on drugs and incarceration. So those different kinds of things we've seen some papers apologize for. And one that I've had my eye on actually is The Guardian in the UK. And they did a whole 10-step thing last year where they did a research essay into their paper and their connections to anti-Blackness and slavery in particular. They did a whole research essay tracking the funds that funded the paper and who had connections to money that was fueled by slavery transactions or slave transactions. And then they went and they took that research and they understood how their narratives normalized slavery in Manchester. And then from there, they started to talk about programs and beats that would be in response to the harm that they had done in community. And they have also set aside funding for different communities there. And I think even one here, I don't want to be wrong, but I think it's in Appalachia. And so that's an interesting one for me in terms of recognizing and acknowledging harm, but also moving investments and moving power and moving resources, because too often what we see is an apology, but what we need is like a shift in resources. We need a shift in narrative. We need a shift in power. And so I'm not giving them an A+, because a lot of times we have to, when it comes to redressing harm, we need time to see how things are actually dwelled out. But I think that is an interesting model that more folks should look into, as that furthers the work beyond just creating editorials that explain kind of how they've impacted community.
Beautiful. So I think we're kind of wrapping up here. We only have a few minutes left with our guests. If you have any last questions, please throw them in the chat. If we do not get to those today, we will definitely, we're keeping a list of them. We'll get back to all of you in an email, some specific ones if we need to. So please don't think just because we're running out of time, we don't have time for your questions. We will still get to those even after. I just want to end it on a little bit more of a positive note. Joe, Diamond, can you identify maybe an interaction you've had with a news leader or a story you've read that says, okay, this is hard work, but we're making progress, we're getting there? Do you have any of those that you can kind of uplift us with?
I'm always in deep thought. I love that question, and I'm thinking because there's so many. That's part of like the reparative journalism work, is that there's more repair and healing happening than we could even know of, because part of our information system is not working to show that to us. And so that's one of the things that I love about my work, is that there are so many people doing the work. There are so many people that are repairing and healing one relationship at a time, one story at a time. And I don't know if I could pick one story, but I will shout out 2 orgs because I really can't even like pick one story. But there's this org called Reckon News, and they have a section, a part of their news org called Black Joy. And they just present stories about Black joy, and they talk about Black culture. And they have a newsletter that comes out, I think, every week that just talks about history. It talks about food. It talks about dance. And I just really love it. And I always want to shout them out, because a lot of times when we talk about news, we think that it has to like be more serious, it has to be more hard hitting, but there's something so beautiful about reflecting people's joy back to them. And I think that's really what's sustainable. And then I'll also shout out the Tribe. They're in Chicago, and they do really good work. Like, there are so many orgs that do really good work, but they're such a small team, but you would not know it. based on how much coverage they do in Chicago. And we all know that Chicago is probably one of like the hot spots for wrong narratives about people, incorrect narratives about people that impact their actual lives, that impact investments. And so I think that it's really important work. They do the work to tell holistic stories about joy, about politics, about culture. If you go on their website, they even have a map of like different events that are going on in the city so that you can tap in with community. But they're all about reshaping the narrative that's been told about Chicago. And they also do the work to dispel myths. Like when we see reports about gun violence that are incorrect, you can see tribe reporters actually putting in the numbers and the percentages that they've researched. So I would say those two. I don't know.
No, yeah, there's so much great work. It's just like happening in pockets of the country. And some of what we do is just, hey, we're all doing this together, y'all. I love Josie Public Square Amplified, incredible work. You know, I just so many cool people. Carl, who was in the room. As we wrap up, Joe, do you want to just take 30 seconds to maybe share your uplifting kind of
Yeah,
example?
my 30 seconds is that the California Reparations Task Force actually in its final recommendations, it has a whole section that deals with culture, and it talks about journalism and these apologies, and it talks about the FCC. It talks about a lot of things culturally, right? Hollywood and all that. But in its final recommendations, it included the understanding like we have to get to a reparative future, and it included the call for a reparative fund to fund culture, to cultural work. Now, the next stage of this fight is going to be trying to get the California legislature to pass it. But it was an acknowledgement in the task force that there needs to be some sort of reparative action when it comes to funding to fund Black institutions to do the cultural work that's needed for repair. So that happened last year. Several months ago, and so that was like for us, it was really like it was affirming that like maybe in other states as well, like in New York now and other states, that they will address culture and media, and also the need to provide resources to address the very kind of repair that we're talking about here today and Diamond's talking about. So I'll stop there.
Mhm. No, this was an incredible hour. Definitely a highlight for my week. And I will speak for everyone here that we all enjoy just kind of hearing your expertise, just really grounding what is a very, very abstract conversation and helping folks understand not only what needs to happen, but their role in making that happen. So I just want to thank you so much, Diamond, Joe, Benicia, the Media 2070 team for sharing so much of their insight today, explaining media reparations and just what journalism needs right now. So I think so many of us here, and I saw from the comments, we know firsthand what everyone was talking about. And so much of Media 2070's work is coming together, dreaming of this stuff together, and saying, okay, now we're moving forward. So thank you all for being here. I want to close this space and just thank you all for your time. It means so much to come together in community. Obviously, we're here for the long haul, 2070. This work doesn't end here. So please sit tight for more information. We'll be sending out an email with not only the link to the actual event here today, but to the videos that Diamond shared. We'll also keep you posted about the work to come when the new videos come out, the paper on the FCC, so that you all just stay in constant communication with us and we can continue to build. If you have registered for this, it'll be super easy. If for some reason you're watching this and you haven't registered, just please email one of us your contact information so we can get it over to you. So again, thank you all. Be well, be inspired, and let's make change together. Have a great day.